Greetings from Health and Beyond, and welcome to our session on Nipah Insights, Decoding the Threat. I'm Dr. Shanta Misra, Health Communication and Wellness Expert, and your host for today's session. This is about a virus that doesn't just travel through the air, but through the very food we eat and the animals around us. It's a pathogen carrying a high fatality. It's the Nipah virus that we will discuss today. First identified in 1998 in Malaysia, named after the village Sungai Nipah. It is a zoonotic virus, meaning it jumps from animals to humans. The primary home for the virus is the fruit bat, also known as the flying fox. These bats carry the virus without getting sick, but they can pass it to humans through contaminated fruit or raw date palm sap. At present, there is no vaccine against it. In today's episode, we will talk about this virus and how a One Health approach would bridge the gap between animal health and human safety. We have today Professor Dr. R. Sajith Kumar from Kottayam in Kerala. Professor Sajith is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Infectious Diseases and Department of Medical Education in Government Medical College and Hospital, Kottayam. He is the convener of the National Medical Commission for Faculty Development in Medical Education Technologies and continues to be associated with a number of other academic and research councils at the national and international levels. Kerala has seen many outbreaks of Nipah in the past, and he's the best person to decode the threat about this disease. Welcome to our show, Professor Sajith Kumar. We have had this recent outbreak of the Nipah virus in West Bengal. We understand Kerala has seen these outbreaks in the past. For our viewers, can you please elaborate on its spread and the disease it causes, and how serious is this illness?
Yeah, actually, if you look at how the whole issue of Nipah came up, it was in 1998, maybe about 30 years back, that in Malaysia, large number of people were dying of respiratory problem. And then they found that this disease was more common in those people who were associated with pig farming. Around 283, around 300 cases were identified at that time, of which 100 people died. That's a mortality of around 30%, which is pretty high for any epidemic. Subsequently, that died out. But then after a few years, we had a cluster which came up in Bangladesh, in which around 300 people again were affected. But this time, the mortality was around 65%. More than 200 people died. And then there were a few outbreaks, few clusters, I must say, which were happening. We had the perhaps the most frightening epidemic in Kerala a few years back, when 17 people were affected, of which 14 people died. That is perhaps the highest mortality that was ever reported. And this actually made us very worried about, why this epidemic is happening and things like that. In Bangladesh, actually, it was attributed to the consumption of the date palm juice, which was actually consumed in the place of liquor by the local people. And this was further investigated, and they found that it was actually the bats which actually drank the same fruit sap, also the palm sap. That were found to be the cause of disease there. When it came to the Kerala epidemic, there was nothing like date palm sap here. But then when we analyzed the ecological features related to those particular people who died, we found that it was because of a very close association with the bats. In fact, one of the persons who is supposed to be one of the index cases was a person who actually was working in a well, cleaning the well surroundings. Actually, the well was inhabited by the fruit bats. And he obviously had some unpleasant encounters accidental contacts with these bats, and that was probably related as a cause of the disease. Subsequently, we had occasional sporadic cases in the next 2 years, but none of them were very closely associated with any natural exposure to any of these animals. And recently, most of you must have read in the papers that in West Bengal, actually, it is not in a very remote place. It is actually in the 24 Parganas district. Two healthcare workers were affected with Nipah virus disease. The issue is this is a disease which can sometimes be mistaken for any other viral illness. People might think that the patient is dying of some other disease, and it's quite possible that one of the patients in those hospitals where these healthcare workers were working probably would have died of the disease undiagnosed, and then these people must have got the disease, and a high index of suspicion only will pick up these diseases. That is the problem. This is one of those so-called exotic viruses, which usually has a life cycle which is there in the animals, particularly bats, as we know now. The bats which are around the human surroundings, the peri-domestic bats, who actually are vegetarians. They eat mostly on the fruits and nuts and all those things in the surroundings. And from them, it crosses over to the human beings only when there is a very significant contact between the human beings and the animals. But unfortunately, once it gets into the human beings, it acquires the ability to get transmitted to very close contacts. So human to human transmission begins there. And once human to human transmission begins, the virulence of the organism increases. So much so, the mortality also increases. And it does not spread like an epidemic like what you see in COVID. But it can actually produce a disease in a large number of very close contacts. And that is the scenario what we get in the case of Nipah. And this is just to summarize the epidemiology and the history of Nipah and how the disease gets spread. Thank you.
So what could be some of the specific red flag symptoms that should tell a family member that this is not a normal flu or fever and that they need to get to the hospital immediately?
Yeah, the virus actually behaves like any other virus once it enters the human body. It produces upper respiratory symptoms. It sometimes produces aches and pains all over the body, fever, running nose, and similar features. But very soon, within a matter of 24 to 48 hours, the disease dichotomizes into two patterns. One is the encephalitic pattern, and the other is the respiratory pattern. These are not exclusive, but most of the time somebody can develop respiratory or encephalitic only. But occasionally, some patients can develop both of these. Now, what happens in 24 to 48 hours, the patient goes on to develop severe respiratory distress, amounting to something what we used to see in the case of the SARS epidemic, where the patient's lungs get infiltrated and the patient goes on to develop severe hypoxia. And most of the times, the patient will die if not properly taken care of within about 24 to 48 hours. So it's a matter of about 3 to 4 days with the beginning of the flu-like illness. In the encephalitic form, the patient becomes drowsy very fast. He goes on to develop unconsciousness, and occasional instances of seizures have been reported. So there again, the disease progresses very fast, but the disease progression is not that fast as in the case of respiratory illness. And the patient goes on to a coma from which he practically never recovers. The mortality rate is quite high. If not taken care of properly, the mortality rate could be as high as 100%. That is what is reported. But the usual mortality rate is around the tune of 60 to 75%. So if you find that most of the times what happens in these clusters is that the first case goes undiagnosed. Because practically the index of suspicion will not be high at that stage. But when a contact develops the disease and he also goes through the same path, then we start suspecting that it is Nipah virus. And that is when we try to find out the organism either from the CSF or from the blood or respiratory secretions. And only when that high index of suspicion is there, we are going to think about this. So the message for the average layman is that if the flu doesn't improve in a matter of 2 days or 3 days, or if there is worsening of symptoms with respiratory involvement or clouding of consciousness, irritability, abnormal brain functions, it is almost mandated that the patient has to seek immediate medical care. And the moment the patient enters a hospital with an encephalitic form, most of the times they will do a lumbar puncture. They will collect the CSF from the spinal fluid, and then If it is a respiratory case, even an X-ray might trigger the diagnosis because the patient may go in for an ARDS very fast. So these are the perhaps the red flag signs that you have to be careful about. Occasional cases have been reported with hepatic involvement where the patient presents with severe jaundice or myocarditis-like manifestation. So in short, it behaves like a violent viral infection. So that is the one which should make people suspect that this is a possibility. Then, of course, if the person has a history of being exposed to the forest area, he has a
Yes.
history of biting, taking fruits from areas which he is not familiar with, which might probably have been bitten by the bats, etc. It could be dangerous. Exposing themselves to the urine of the bats, or sometimes like we used to say, you fight with the dogs. So sometimes people fight with the bats also for something. So
Okay.
that can also be dangerous. And the bats, as you know, have usually a nocturnal behavior. They are
Yes.
active during the night hours. So if somebody is working outside, particularly outside the around the home in the plantation area and things like that, where the bats are likely to be there, that's a risky factor.
How do we prevent this infection, and are there any specific preventive medicines or vaccines at the moment?
At the moment, vaccines are still under development, and medicines and vaccines for this particular disease has been tried in a good number of laboratories. But the problem is that a human trial is practically difficult because we don't get that many number of cases. For practical purposes, the statement would be that there is no currently available medicines and vaccines which can protect. But what has to be taken care of is that if you find that any epidemic of or any cluster of diseases are likely to happen in and around the surroundings, we immediately give an alert. In fact, Kerala has become the leader in preventive management of, or perhaps public health intervention in the case of Nipah. Because what we do is, as soon as a person is admitted, we always have a contact tracing. And that has happened in the case of the Bengal incident also recently. So 150 contacts of this particular persons are traced and they are kept under observation so that if they develop the disease, they should not transmit the disease to another person. So they're kept under quarantine, observed regularly. During those periods, we always used to ask people not to venture outside too much, particularly during the night hours, and be careful with the fruit trees and plants which the bats are attracted to. And of course, for the healthcare workers, this is another very threatening situation. I think we'll discuss about that a little later.
Yes, yes. The next question is about what precautions are required to be taken by our hospital staff, doctors, nurses, and others, and our community health workers to not only protect themselves but also allay fears and anxiety. But when
Yeah,
the patient comes into the hospital, he's already infectious, isn't it? So are
yeah,
they
most of the
wearing their
time.
hazmat?
Most of the times, the story usually is that they go to some local hospital where they're taken care of just like any other case of viral fever. And the moment they start developing very serious respiratory problems or encephalitic presentations, they are usually referred to the another hospital, which you may not be the tertiary hospital, which may be something like a secondary institution. And from there, they land up in the tertiary hospital, by which time, it would be around 3 to 4 days. And most of the times, a couple of healthcare workers are already exposed. That is what usually happens. The story here is that, in any case of viral fever with respiratory or brain involvement, healthcare workers have to be extremely careful. Actually, all the contact precautions which we advise for COVID, that is something which most of the population know already, using the PPE, mask, goggles, and other things. That is necessary when a case of Nipah is being taken care of. But let us remember that the man-to-man transmission rate is not that high. And if we take almost the standard precautions like the airborne precautions, what we used to say, I think these days most of the healthcare workers are using the masks in most of the hospital environments. And whenever somebody is having a respiratory problem, whenever somebody is having breathlessness, cough, or sneezing, even common people are forced to use the mask these days. So that will give sufficient protection for them. But if a case is identified, obviously that has to be submitted to very serious airborne transmission precautions and contact transmission precautions. So infection control practice inside the hospital must be strengthened, particularly during the situations where a case is being identified. But this has to be strengthened throughout, because India is one country where vast experiences and vast type of exposures happen to lots of people around. And in fact, we lost one healthcare worker in Kerala who was caring for these patients, and that happened at a stage when the diagnosis was not there. But once the diagnosis is there, standard precautions will definitely protect you. So not to worry too much about it, but to be careful. That is the message that we would like to give to the healthcare workers.
The final question says, why is this only in these two states? And what is your advice to the community in general in safeguarding themselves against infection and future outbreaks?
Well, to the first part of the question, practically I don't have an answer, because this is just an, I will say that this is most probably because of the good surveillance system that we have in Kerala. And in fact, the doctors have been, alerted to that extent that if we test a large number of people for Nipah, and when you test thousands only, you are going to get one case. So if you avoid the testing unnecessarily, perhaps within inverted commas, for those 1,000 patients, you would never pick up a case of Nipah. So surveillance is one mechanism by which you pick up large number of cases. And of course, orientation for doctors, orientation for healthcare workers is important, so that they recognize, or perhaps they have in mind about the issue of Nipah. And that is one way by which we can actually pick up cases early. I don't think that
also heavy forested areas. Is it that? I mean,
Kerala actually is totally a forest area. You can't
it is.
Every house.
There are no skyscrapers there.
Yeah,
I hope.
Yeah, there is every house has got plenty of trees, and many of them are fruit trees. And these days, planting fruit trees has become a common passion among
I was
people.
just going to ask you that. I mean, if we have some tomato plants growing in our balcony, will they?
Well, not impossible. The bats can definitely come there. So what we would suggest to the common man is that if you find a fruit lying on the floor, beaten by any animal, it's better not to take that, unless, because Nipah is not that far away. It is almost very close to us, but not that close. But it is there in the environment. So we have to be careful in that aspect. And I don't think other states of India don't have Nipah. It's that mostly many of the cases are undiagnosed and undetected, because if somebody dies of an encephalitic illness or respiratory illness, they will most probably attribute it to ARDS due to viral infection, ARDS due to viral pneumonia, and viral encephalitis they will diagnose. Which virus? Many institutions may not take that trouble to look which virus is producing the encephalitis. So that may be the reason why other areas are not getting affected. Obviously, of course, we have a lot to learn from further clusters, even though we don't want them to happen, because a lot remains to be learned about the Nipah virus transmission and epidemiology.
Thank you, Professor Sajith. I'm sure our viewers are more knowledgeable now about this virus and the disease. As we wrap up today's episode, it is important to remember that while the Nipah virus is formidable, it is not invisible. Our best defense is a community that is informed and not fearful. And to our hospital staff and healthcare workers, you are the most at risk, but also our strongest line of defense. Protection starts with protocol of rigorous infection prevention and control and prompt reporting of suspected cases. Thank you, Dr. Sajith.
Thank you.
Thank you. Namaskar.